So for those of you who have been with us since Friday morning or even Thursday night, we thank you for your attentiveness and support, and we hope that you found this summit enlightening and compelling and useful, and we're not done yet. For those of you who might just be joining us, of course, welcome. You've picked a good time to jump in right before a keynote presentation on Robert Nisbet against Mars, Leviathan, and Demos. It is my privilege to introduce Bradley J. Birzer, Professor of History and Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies at Hillsdale College right here in the great state of Michigan. Professor Birzer has been teaching at Hillsdale since 1999. He's a co-founder of the online journal, The Imaginative Conservative. Professor Birzer has also been a fellow of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and the McConnell Center at the University of Louisville. During the 2014-2015 academic term, he also served as visiting scholar of conservative thought and policy at the University of Colorado Boulder. His latest book, Russell Kirk, American Conservative, published by the University of Kentucky Press, received the Henry and Ann Paolucci Book Award from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute last year. Please help me welcome Brad Birzer. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I thank you so much, Gleaves, for having me. This is great. I've known Gleaves now for a very long time. Last year, I spent probably the first 10 minutes of my talk just saying how much I loved Gleaves. And I thought, hopefully, if you want to go back and watch that, because that was actually taped last year, right? And you can go back. And I've had people write me and say, "Now you spent all this time talking about some guy named Cleaves. Who is this?" And I write back and I said, no, he was the host, right? Gleaves Whitney. So anyway, thank you, Gleaves, very much. And Scott, for that nice introduction and for everything, going back and forth on all kinds of things. I don't know if I can't quite see everyone in here who's here, but I do want to thank Winston Elliott, who's in the back, greeted me last night when I got in. Winston and I founded the Imaginative Conservative 6 years ago, and it's really through his genius and his imagination that it's grown to what it has grown to, because when we started it, it was really just a blog for about 14 to 15 to maybe 20 of us writing back and forth, and I'm not allowed to give numbers out because of how that works, but let's just say our readership has skyrocketed on a daily basis. In fact, those 14 people are probably every second or so, actually, at this point. So anyway, it's been an amazing ride over the last 6 years, and it's been great. I also want to thank Gary Gregg, who I do see back there, and Jeff Pollitt, good friends. I don't know if Ingrid Gregg is in here, also close friend. Annette Kirk back there. I've got a former student, Tomas, right up here in the middle. So anyway, it's great, and I'm very, very glad to be here. Well, what I'd like to do this afternoon is I would like to talk a little bit about Robert Nisbet, who was at one point a household name back in the 1960s, not really in the 50s, but he made had a big reputation in the 1960s, amazingly enough, by both the New Left and the New Right. They both tried to claim him, and you can see that in their respective statements in the Sharon statement written on Bill Buckley's front lawn in his house, and then also with the Port Huron statement written here in Michigan. You can see the imprint of Nisbet. He's very much, even though Nisbet would have been a conservative, and he's one of these conservatives who I think by the end of his life was so leery of any governmental organization that he would never have embraced this term. And the term, of course, for most of us means a bomb thrower, which he most certainly was not. But he came as close to an anarchist as I've seen in any thinker of the 20th century who did not embrace that term, especially those who would have been on the conservative or libertarian side of things. He did not call himself that. I am using that term in retrospect as the term has taken on some slightly different connotations in the 21st century, some good, some bad. But he also never called himself a libertarian, and yet in his what we might call anti-statism, his fear of Leviathan and of Demos and of Mars, I have yet to read the most radical libertarian who was more critical of the state than was Robert Nisbet towards the end of his life. He was writing articles in the 1980s into the 1990s. He passed away in 1996. But he was writing articles on why the entire history of politics is the history of euphemism. And he did not mean that as an exaggeration. He went back to the rise of the Roman Empire and even back to some of the Greek city-states that had gone wrong and showed how the language was corrupted intentionally by the political class from the beginning to be able to use language that would soothe the people, at the same time allow the political class to do whatever it wanted against the people, often with the people cheering them on as they were being abused. So Nisbet's an amazing figure, and yet because he never does embrace terms like libertarianism or anarchism, there was a certain respectability to him that I think other people who would have not been as radical did not have that same kind of respectability. I think of someone maybe known to a few of you, certainly known in libertarian circles, someone like Murray Rothbard, who had a very, very tight but very small following. He was nowhere nearly as radical as Nisbet. Nisbet, though, had a much larger following, I think, because he wasn't using those kind of labels and wasn't running with that crowd. So interesting to see how that plays out and what he was able to do in his own life. So Robert Nisbet was born, he's from a Southern family originally. His family has deep Southern roots, mostly Christian Science roots. They were a product of the Second Great Awakening. They had migrated, though, to California, and he was born in a tiny town called Maricopa in California. He despised this place, even though he loved his family and he loved growing up where he did in terms of the people he grew up with. He was not at all a fan of this place out in the desert of California, which he believed was a kind of purgatory, even as a child, even as a Christian Science child. He thought it was a bit of a purgatory. And he writes about this in his own autobiography, which he wrote a couple. He never wrote a full one. He always wrote snippets, really autobiographical snippets. But he writes about how important his schooling was for him and why the desert awakened his imagination. And we do think of him. In the end of his life, he lived in New York City. He had the highest paid chair in America in the late 1970s when he was at Columbia with the Albert Schweitzer chair. He then went on to the American Enterprise Institute after that. So we associate him quite often with the East Coast, but almost his entire career was spent either in California or in Arizona. It was only in that last decade and a half or so, actually 2 decades, that last 2 decades of his life, that he was on the East Coast. But looking back on his time in California, he writes, "I'm very glad, though, that by the reason of my father's work, they were obliged to go to Maricopa. Its ugliness and hostile challenge to the human spirit drove me straight to books for a haven and the experience of something, anything vicarious. Maricopa, as if a penance for its physical failings, had, amazingly enough, an excellent school system and a public library, and I profited from both. This was a day and age in which school delinquencies were regarded as emanations of original sin, not as afflictions of society, and therefore those who disrupted the school were treated accordingly as those who had embraced sin. My own knuckles still remember the sharp edge of a teacher's ruler coming down on them. I do not remember if that was just or not." And I'm sure many of us, I certainly remember some very strong Dominican rulers coming down as well back in the 70s in small town Kansas. "The public library," Nisbet continues, "was my chief delight. Everything that the formidable desert made impossible in the way of living was available vicariously in our surprisingly large number of books on the shelves of that small library. I had learned to read before beginning school, and from sitting on my mother's lap while she read aloud to me, this all added measurably to the success in school. It added immeasurably to the state of my mind, and I read novels in vast quantities, but by dint of browsing and experiment, found my way to other things, chiefly everything biographical and historical." Interestingly enough, though, he is best known as a sociologist, and really one of a sociologist, a whole kind of a small part of the sociological school that really developed out of Berkeley in the 1930s, where he went to college, then earned his MA, then his PhD, and then ended up teaching there for the first 13 years of his career. He really did, in so many ways, not only help found the practice of sociology in the West, but he was, more or less, the great sociologist. So, as I was mentioning a moment ago, he was often embraced by both the New Left and the New Right. And the other person, who I think bears mentioning at this point, was a figure who was regarded as his equal by the early 1960s, or he, I should say more accurately, was regarded as this man's equal, and that was C. Wright Mills. I think this is important to note because as we're having a dialogue here between conservatives and progressives and some in between, in the 1950s and the 1960s, no matter how divided people were, there was always that element where they had a kind of common liberal education, they had read the same books, they had many of the same mores and norms, and they were able to talk to one another. And just imagine, no matter how radical the old left was in their own views, they were still incredibly respectable people. These were people who, if they didn't attend church because they were old left, they might have gone to socialist Sunday school. Or if there was a party down the street, they participated in that. Now they may be striking and may be writing propaganda about the Reds, usually in favor, obviously, but they were still very respectable people who believed in traditional education, who believed in liberal learning. And that's very different than what we see with the rise of the new left in the 1960s. The red diaper babies, the children of the old left, who of course had a very different sensibility. And even though a C. Wright Mills and a Robert Nisbet may not on the surface seem to have much in common, they actually believed in almost everything in unison, though they may have approached it differently. They were both deeply concerned about the growth of the American state abroad. They were both deeply concerned about the growth of the American state at home because they feared conformity arising, whether it was in corporations or in public schools. And they were worried about the nature of technology and how it might dehumanize us. We remember C. Wright Mills, those of us on the conservative side, because of his influence on Eisenhower in the farewell address with the military-industrial complex. But these were not really left-right issues in the 1950s. There was a lot of agreement between the two sides that these things had to be avoided. We didn't want conformity, whether it was conformity in Walmart or conformity in front of NASCAR or conformity in a corporation or through government. We were worried. People who cared were worried about those things, and it was not a left-right issue. So Nisbet was very important for that, bringing up many of these ideas. But after he's at Berkeley, he ends up founding, he's one of the two major founders of the University of California, Riverside. It was an experimental college founded in 1952 and 1953. He served as dean there for much of his career. After he had been there for close to 20 years, he went to the University of Arizona, had a very, very nice offer there, but ended up not liking it at all. I've not been able to figure out what happened there. It certainly was not environment. He liked the environment. He thought Arizona was beautiful, but did not get along with his colleagues, which is odd considering what kind of person he was. Again, this is not something I've looked into, but need to figure out why he left as quickly as he did. But he was then offered the very first Albert Schweitzer chair at Columbia, and he took that, a very prestigious position, certainly for him. So very much an academic. Let me note just a couple of other things about him, and then I want to move into some of his deeper thoughts, or at least what I consider to be his deeper thoughts, on the nature of history and time and progress, and what his criticisms were. Whether we share those or not, I find them fascinating and certainly worth thinking about. If we go back and look at Nisbet's writings, there are a number of things that he was preoccupied with. For one thing, he was deeply concerned about the rise of evangelicalism in America. He was an old Goldwaterite. He believed that religion had absolutely no place in the public sphere outside of ministers being able to speak their mind, but not in the way that it might determine a party. He was no friend of people like Jerry Falwell. He was no friend of people like Oral Roberts. These were the enemy to him. And he believed, starting in the early 1970s, that with the rise of the new right, that conservatism was probably a lost cause. And Barry Goldwater, of course, had the exact same view. If you remember, many times he got up in front of the Senate and said that he would do almost anything to be able to have Jerry Falwell in front of him to give him a quick, swift kick in the, and I won't use Goldwater's language, but it's not that bad, right? It's the same thing we use for a donkey. But that's where he wanted to put his foot. And there was that feeling among many people, especially those who were pretty anti-statist, within the Republican Party that this was a great danger. They didn't like Nixon, of course. They believed that Nixon had kowtowed way too much to religious and evangelical forces, especially Billy Graham, and they were worried what was going to happen with this. Nisbet, after this kind of change, that is, once we saw that there was some kind of infiltration by religious forces into conservatism, he really did think this was a lost cause. And probably for a lot of people on the right today, they'd be shocked to know that Nisbet was pretty open to things like abortion. And that, I think that would be very surprising to a lot of people who kind of like him and cite him and see him somewhat in the pantheon of conservative thinkers. But this all came back to his idea of religion and religion in politics. He believed that those kinds of issues, issue like an abortion, this was an issue that was best decided by persuasion in society, not necessarily by force on one side or the other. But there were other things he was very interested in. He believed that society, not just the Republicans, but the society as a whole after the 1960s had entered what he called, and because he was not a religious person at all, we can't go back and say, oh, there was some kind of evangelicalism in this. But he believed not that we were in an apocalypse, but that we were in some kind of twilight phase in Western civilization. These had come and gone. We'd weathered them before. Most likely we'll weather them now. But this meant, starting in the early 1970s, when we entered this twilight phase, he believed that it was probably the job of good women and men to start preserving that which had come before us, and not really to spend our time trying to innovate or to advance anything more than what would be necessary for a humane living. We needed to preserve the great books. We needed to preserve great architecture. We needed to preserve human dignity in a variety of ways. And he never said, he wasn't a nut about this. He never said, well, I predict this will last 500 years or so. He just believed we were entering a twilight age and that we as good people had to start changing our tactics as we started thinking about how to deal with the world. Why did he think this? There were really two reasons that he believed we were entering this twilight phase. He was all in favor of innovation in art, innovation in theater, in movies. He had nothing against that. He actually was a great devotee of science fiction and of Westerns and anything that he thought unleashed the imagination, he was fine with. So it wasn't a reaction of a kind of snobbish attitude towards a more popular culture. That was not a problem for him. But what he did worry about is he believed that overall in society, we had been trading excellence in terms of technique and efficiency for excellence in terms of the human condition. That is, we were building better stuff, but we were not working on maintaining the humane dignity of the human person. This was true in the way we were dealing with Vietnam or Cambodia. This was the way that we were dealing with Watergate. This was the way we were dealing with our problems on campus at places like Kent State. He was not immune to what was going on in terms of the culture in the 1960s. But he believed that our response, especially in kind of a radical individualism, as he would have put it, was to let loose our own morality and to instead become very interested in our toys and our stuff. He had thought this had been happening since World War II, but he believed that this had crept more into culture by the 1970s, and he often used the language of technique and efficiency versus humanity and moral excellence. So we may be able to design a small Macintosh for our wrist, but what about raising our children with proper morality and, for lack of a better term, the golden rule? And again, he's not very religious, but he understands there have to be things that we teach, whether it's the Socratic understanding or Platonic, whatever it may be. We need a certain set of ethics that we have to focus on. But the second thing he was deeply worried about, and it sounds like, and I apologize that I was not able to see these discussions, especially from the one that was last night, he was deeply worried about the politicization of society. In this sense, Nisbet is very much a 19th century traditionalist. And though he would never have called himself a traditionalist, he was when it came to ideas of politics. Politics were fine. He was not, despite what I said 20 minutes ago, he was not exactly an anarchist. but he was very leery about politics going beyond its own sphere. If you want to have the sphere of family and religion and school and business, all of that is fine. But politics is just one more sphere in all of that. It is not, from his perspective, that thing which should govern all other things. This was deeply worrisome to him. He saw this as yet another move towards efficiency in the human condition, but loss of dignity in the human condition. And he believed that with this politicization of society, that we were essentially selling our free will to the machine. I know that's very romantic language, and it sounds like I'm quoting a Pink Floyd album, which in a way I am. But that is exactly how Nisbet thought about this. We were truly becoming some cog in this vast societal machine in which all the levers were being pulled by bureaucrats and by corporate heads. And now, in the early 1970s, it looks like religious leaders as well. That was the danger that he saw, this kind of conglomeration. So whereas someone like C. Wright Mills was fearful about universities and corporations and the military coming together, Nisbet was concerned about corporations, the military, and the government coming together as well. It's a different kind, it's more of a cultural industrial complex than a military one, but the military is still there. Nisbet went so far, especially in his military views, his extremely anti-military views. This was something that got him in a lot of trouble during the Reagan years because he was so adamantly opposed to US involvement anywhere abroad at all. And of course, what we saw in the first Gulf War was just anathema to Nisbet. This was the proof that the evangelicals, in his mind, had taken over the Republican Party, and we were waging essentially a holy war. And worse, not just a holy war, but a war in terms of gaining oil. So on one hand, we're fighting in the name of Christ. On the other hand, we're doing this for oil. There really couldn't have been much worse in Nisbet's mind. But after the 1970s, he became so concerned about this. He actually wrote one of his most interesting books that almost everybody forgets, a book that came out in the late 1980s that was all from his Jefferson lectures through the National Endowment for the Humanities. And in this book, The Present Age, he starts off by saying, if any single one of the founding fathers, whether it was George Washington or Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson, showed up in Washington, D.C. today, what would they be most surprised by? He said, most conservatives will tell you big government. He says, no, that's not it at all. It would be the permanent standing army. They would not understand that. This would be so confusing to all of them that, yes, of course we have to have a standing Navy, but a standing army? This is not, and he's right about this. Going back and look at the writings of the founders, even all the way through Madison's presidency, of course, the tradition was you may have to raise an army for a bit, but that army never lasts. And even when we had a permanent army, it was always about 7,000 men and officers throughout the 19th century, those almost all garrisoned on the western frontier. So we've always had that tradition. But Nisbet says, and he writes this in 1988, we are now in the 75th year of the 20th century war. He believed that starting in 1914, we as a Western civilization had never left war. We as Americans had been in a constant state of war for the most part, with the exception, obviously, of Harding and Coolidge. We had been in a war for almost the entire 20th century. So this was very, very worrisome to him. And now, I'm sure, and I look out, and not to offend anyone, I would guess that many of us are the same age. I think, and Winston and I were talking about this last night, when I graduated college, it was the year after the wall came down. This was a jubilant time. I could have easily said when I graduated in 1990 that, things seem to be pretty peaceful. We're the only superpower. There are things, of course, Moscow still reigned, but not for long. There are things we can do that we could never do before. We're going to have now the ability to reduce our military to almost nothing. And by the way, race relations are pretty fantastic. Well, could anybody really say, doesn't matter for left or right, who in 2017 wants to say that we're not at a permanent state of war and that race relations are just great? It's tragic It's terrible. Teaching my students in American heritage. Think about this. You think about how different this is. So, progress, conservatism, where does it come in? That's something that I want to turn to now. In all of Nisbet's writings, Nisbet was primarily concerned with three thinkers. And I'm going to quote from each one of them, not a lot, but just a little bit. There were three thinkers that Nisbet brought forth. Most of these thinkers we take for granted now. Almost all of these thinkers were brought up in the 1940s, in large part because of people like Leo Strauss and Russell Kirk, Peter Stanlis, and Robert Nisbet, really introducing these figures to such an extent that there was no way to go past them. So to this present day, it doesn't matter if we're at Amherst, or if we're at Hillsdale, or if we're at Grand Valley, most likely our students at least know of these figures, even if they haven't read them. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of course, critical for the French Revolution. Impossible to describe the French Enlightenment without thinking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And then Edmund Burke, the great figure of the post-conservative revival, post-World War II conservative revival, and Alexis de Tocqueville. Russell Kirk, I would say, and we have his widow here, Annette Kirk, in the audience. Russell Kirk, I think we can show definitively, it would just be impossible to argue against this. Russell Kirk was the definitive figure for bringing Edmund Burke back into the forefront of American society and Western society. Whether we like Kirk or agree with him or disagree with him, it's just inescapable that his book, The Conservative Mind, following on about 6 or 7 years of scholarship on Burke, was that great synthesis that really did make Burke a household name in America. And given the context of the times, I don't want to historicize it too much, but this makes perfect sense. When we think about who we are as Americans, we come back out of World War II. Who are we as Americans? It's one of those things we can say, well, we know we're not Nazis and we know we're not communists, but what are we? And now it would not be unusual for any one of us to whip out a pocket constitution. That would not have been the case in 1946 or 47. You may have given everything on the beaches of Normandy. Maybe let's say you've given everything or almost everything and survived. The chances that then if you were asked, well, what does it mean to be an American or to be a citizen of the West, it'd be very difficult for almost any American to answer, even a vet in 1946, 1947. So one of the things we gravitated to, the left and the right did this, though there's no doubt it was definitely moved by the right more than the left at this point, was to grab two figures who really did seem to represent the best of the modern West. And Edmund Burke was the first and foremost, and Kirk is really the figure responsible for bringing Burke back. Not alone. There are a lot of people involved. Still, we have academics still at Harvard. Harvey Mansfield, who was a part of that at the beginning of his career back in the 50s, now, of course, towards the end of his career. But there was a whole movement for that. But we also know that de Tocqueville came back. So if you go back and look at the publication dates, nobody was printing, reprinting, or publishing Edmund Burke or Alexis de Tocqueville since the very end of the 19th century. There are not books being written about them. They were not major figures. Then suddenly you get to 1946, Democracy in America is reprinted. Reflections on the Revolution in France, further reflections on the Revolution of France. The Letter of a Genocide Peace, a Regicide Peace, all of these books start coming out in the 1940s. It's Robert Nisbet who is really the key figure in bringing de Tocqueville back into the academy. And again, I don't want to suggest it's single-handed. There are a lot of people who are doing this. But his book, a very famous book, not as famous as The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, but in the same year, The Quest for Community, which really did introduce or reintroduce the notion into Western civilization, and especially into America, the de Tocquevillian idea of what community is. And this is what Nisbet, though he did a number of things, and he was a public intellectual, and if many of you may remember, he used to write regularly for commentary. He used to write regularly for the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, especially all through the 70s and 80s. He wrote constantly as a public intellectual, but in terms of academics, he is remembered as the great beginning of the movement toward community and what community, real community, was. So all of the people now that we think of as communitarians, who are very prevalent in academia, most of them consider themselves on the left, they all still go back to Nisbet, even though Nisbet was not one of them politically, because he's really the beginning of all modern communitarianism and thought on communitarianism. But he was always skeptical about what community really meant. And as much as he wrote about community, he himself was still feeling through his notions of what community were. And he decided that in the study of Western civilization, the best thing to do to understand community was to juxtapose. And please, going back again a half hour, remember, whether it's a school or a corporation or the government or the military, this is a guy who is deeply worried that the 1950s culture is a dying culture because of conformity, because of the rise of the suburbs, because of television, because of TV Guide and TV trays and TV dinners. All of these things were worrisome, not just to people like C. Wright Mills, but to people like Robert Nisbet as well. It's one of the things we often forget about the 1950s. We may remember the image of conformity, but we don't remember how much incredible scholarship came out in opposition to that, and people trying to deal with that. So what Nisbet said was that we need to juxtapose two great visions of community. One is the Rousseauvian vision, the vision from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The other is the vision that we see in Edmund Burke, but then by his greatest student, Alexis de Tocqueville. That's how he positioned this. So we can't really separate, in his mind, in Nisbet's mind, de Tocqueville from Burke, but we also really can't separate Burke from Rousseau, even though they're very opposite. The one thing they have in common, Nisbet understood other figures like Russell Kirk, earlier Irving Babbitt, Paul Emer Moore, understood about Rousseau and Burke. They were both romantics. That's something we often tend to forget. We often, especially, we can say, yes, Rousseau talked about the noble savage, Burke seems much more of a classical figure, but for any of you who've read Romantic literature, whether it's Wordsworth or Coleridge or listened to Beethoven's Sixth, Burke is hovering. Sometimes he appears actually physically in the poetry of Coleridge and Wordsworth, but he hovers over the pastoral symphony. Burke's shadow is everywhere over Beethoven's Sixth. And so he was regarded as also one of the two great founders of Romanticism. And Nisbet wants us to remember that you just can't separate them that easily. Plus, of course, they all hung out in the same circles. Remember, Edmund Burke, one of his closest friends was Adam Smith. One of Adam Smith's closest friends was David Hume. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, when he left France, because he kind of had to, and he went up to Scotland, he stayed with Hume for, it lasted 2 days, actually. Hume kicked him out after 2 days. But, you know, they all knew each other. This is not some abstraction where one is here and another is over there. They knew each other. They were a community in some kind of odd way. They are connected together. But what Nisbet warns us about is this. He says, here is the fear of what Rousseau stands for. Rousseau's vision, which is really the beginning of progressivism as he sees it in the modern world, Rousseau's vision is a vision of all of us being radical individuals, but not persons. That is, in this community, and Rousseau says this very clearly in the social contract, that in the community that we form through our social contract, we willingly strip ourselves of all things that connect us one to another. We strip ourselves of family, maybe of ethnicity, though in a place like France, he didn't explore that too much, of religion, of our fraternal associations, of our academic associations. And in stripping ourselves naked before the public square, we then join as equals within this larger contract, this social body. And what Nisbet argues is whether Rousseau meant this or not, it is one of the most primitive forms of nationalism that we will see arise from the 18th century onward. And Nisbet tries to draw a line. Now, I realize this can go too far, but he does try and draw a line from Rousseau all the way to the French Revolution. That's easy to do. But then from the French Revolution to the Nazi Revolution, as well as to the communist revolutions, the various ones of the 20th century. And he sees all of these as a form of losing our individuality, losing our personhood in the name of this raw, equal individuality into a social whole of some kind. Burke, however, says this is exactly what we cannot do. Burke tells us in his writings that the thing that matters to us most in the human condition and the way that we better ourselves and the way that we demonstrate love is through charity. And charity only comes when we have the space available to us not to reject our past, but to recognize the past, to take that which we have learned from our mothers, from our grandmothers, from our great-grandmothers, from our great-great-great-great-grandmothers, maybe in a recipe we don't even realize came from 200 years back, but has just been passed down, that it's in these things that we root ourselves, and then in that rootedness, then we can innovate. Then, through prudential judgment, we can change. But only if we know who we are. If we merely abstract ourselves to the group, we're essentially giving ourselves over to whatever being or person has the most persuasive or forceful ability to lead. And that is very dangerous. Burke is no fan of letting our fathers determine what we do. Burke often gets a rap that he's just a traditionalist. It's not it at all. Burke says it would be just as foolish to reject everything our fathers gave us as it is to embrace everything. Burke says every generation must decide, is this thing that we've inherited good? Is it evil? Or most likely, is it something in between that we can reform? And that's the difference. Burke gives us so many communities. I'm Brad. I was born in the summer of '67. I was born in Kansas. I was born to a very devout Catholic family. I was born to a Russian-German family. You know, all of those things in some way influence who I am. You don't necessarily have to determine who I am. They're going to determine the genetics I have and the genetics I pass on. But I could reject all of that. I could reject my mother. I could reject my faith. I can't really reject my ethnicity, but I could forget it, maybe never make Hühner Schnitzel again. I mean, there are things that I could do to go away from that. But even in my moving away from those things, I am in a de facto sense acknowledging the power of those things by rejecting them. So this is what Burke tells us. Burke says it's not enough just to have natural community. We also need voluntary community. Now, several of my closest friends are sitting in the room. I'm not related to any one of them, but I have chosen, and they have chosen, to form a friendship that in many ways is as deep as anything I share with my brothers. And that's a choice we have. And Burke says this is what the good society does. It gives us that ability. Are we going to screw up from time to time? Of course. How could we not? This is what we do. We're humans. We're stupid. But we're also incredibly reasonable. And we're also passionate. And these are the things that we find in community, mixing one person to another, having this kind of moment and understanding of who and what we are. So what he ends with then, at least in Nisbet's argument, what Nisbet says is if we want to understand the conflict between Rousseau and Burke, we really do have to turn to de Tocqueville, and especially to the de Tocqueville of 1835 and 1840 in volumes 1 and 2 of Democracy in America, where we see a very, according to Nisbet, a very even-handed approach to what democracy is. It is amazing. There's so much in de Tocqueville that every time we read it, we see both the really good and the really bad. I could clearly pick half the book and say he loves America. I could pick the other half and say he thinks we're the most foolish country in the history of the world. He clearly was not in favor of what we were doing to American blacks or to American Indians. He found this abhorrent. There were things that he was very worried about as us setting the process in motion, and he mocked us a lot. The idea that there had never been a people in the history of the world who, through such liberal and republican language, had ever massacred another people as easily easily as we did the American Indians, and not only to the applause of those at home, but to the applause of Europeans. He's astounded by this, and of course, he's horrified as well in all different kinds of ways. But it's at the end of the book that de Tocqueville finds something quite relevant to who and what we are now in the 1950s and then into the 60s through the 90s. And this is exactly that fear that a C. Wright Mills and a Robert Nisbet and a Leo Strauss and a Russell Kirk and a Flannery O'Connor and a T.S. Eliot all worried about, Ray Bradbury, that we had become this conformist, mass homogenized tapioca people without any real distinction person to person. If we're white collar, we all dress the same, we get on the same commuter train to go into jobs, we sit in our cubicles, we do the same thing, even if we're professional, we're doing the same thing over and over again, and then when it's all done, we go to our mass-created suburbs and we watch our mass-produced entertainment on TV. This was the worry. Who are we? And of course, nobody expressed this better than the man I assume none of us in this room like, President Richard Nixon. Think about when he debates Khrushchev as vice president, and they have the kitchen debate. Khrushchev is giving great language about, well, why is communism important? Because we help one another, and because we work together as a society and we bond. And Nixon, the fool, one of the first times on international TV gets up there and he says, why is America great? Because we produce great kitchen appliances for our housewives. I'm not sure that's going to go over in a lot of places. Yeah, I'm glad to have a nice microwave, and I'm glad to, but I don't know. That's not language that appeals to me. And I think about, well, what a moment. And yet, doesn't that just prove exactly what Nisbet was fearing? This is just every fear writ large now across the screens in the world through this argument that could have been a brilliant argument against Khrushchev. I mean, if you can't beat Khrushchev in debate, something's gone very wrong. Nisbet did not win. Nixon did not win that debate. If we go to chapter 6, the final to last chapter, second to last chapter in Democracy in America, de Tocqueville gives us this image of what a future democracy might look like. It's not determined. De Tocqueville believes in free will. Nisbet believes in free will. Burke believes in free will. They know that we can make choices, but they worry that we're coming to a point where we're not only not really making choices, but we've forgotten we even could make choices. That's the great danger. And de Tocqueville doesn't really have a name for this. He says, well, I don't know what we'd call it. We've never seen it in the world before. It's going to be something new, and it's going to be not really Big Brother. Of course, that term doesn't exist yet. But what it's going to be more like kind of Big Sister, maybe. Someone who really wants to nurture us, but does so not necessarily because she loves us, but because that's what she's supposed to do. Right? That's how he kind of envisions this. He says, if a despotism should be established among the democratic nations of our day, it would probably have a different character. It would be more widespread, but milder. It would not torment men, it would degrade them. Thus, I think the type of oppression which threatens democracies is different from anything there's ever been in the world before. Our contemporaries will find no prototype of it in their memories. I have myself vainly searched for a word which will exactly express the whole of the conception I have formed. Such old words as despotism and tyranny just do not work. The thing is new, and I cannot find a word for it, but I believe it is critical that we try to define it. Over this kind of man, democratic man in the future, whatever this is, over this democratic man stands an immense protective power which is alone responsible for securing their enjoyment and watching over their fate. The power is absolute, it is thoughtful in detail, it is orderly, it is provident, it is gentle. It would resemble parental authority if, father-like, it tried to prepare its changes for a man's life. But on the contrary, this new form of government will try to keep all in perpetual childhood. It will make sure that the citizens enjoy themselves mightily, provided that they do not think about anything but enjoyment. It gladly works for their happiness. Indeed, it wants to be the sole agent and judge of what that happiness is. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, makes rules for their testaments. It will even divide their inheritances. Why should it not entirely relieve them from the trouble of thinking and the cares of living? This will daily make the exercise of free choice less useful and rarer. It will restrict the activity of free will within such a narrow confine, and little by little it will rob each citizen of the proper use of his own faculties. Equality has prepared men for all of this, predisposing them to endure it and even to see it as beautiful. Having thus taken each citizen in turn in its powerful grasp and shaped him to its will, these governments will then extend its embrace to include the whole of society. It will cover the whole of social life with a network of petty, complicated rules that are both minute and uniform, through which even men of the greatest originality and most vigorous temperament will not be able to force their heads above the crowd. It will never break a man's will, but it will soften it, bend it, and guide it. It will seldom enjoin, but it will inhibit its actions. It does not seek to destroy. It prevents free will from ever being born. Now, that's an incredible criticism of what might happen. And I don't think we have to be nut jobs or radicals to say a lot of our life has been shaped by certain forces, whether it's crony capitalism or the military-industrial complex or our school systems, private as well as public. There is no doubt that we live in a society that has a whole network of rules. And we also know that things like competition are often frowned upon, especially among children. We have seen these developments. This is exactly what Nisbet feared, and he believed that these kinds of things had gone into effect, not just in the 1950s, but then again very strongly in the 1970s. Part of this, I think, is age. He's getting older, he's getting grumpier, he's worried about the kinds of things that he had tried to do, that he's not seeing the kinds of changes, he hasn't made the kind of change himself that he would like to, but he still recognized these things, and I think they're worth considering. So let me just end with this, and thank you all very much for listening. I went a little bit longer than I meant to, but I think there's a lot worth thinking about. I'm truly sorry I've not heard the other side of things. Here I am coming in, talking about a conservative. I'm a conservative. I've got my conservative friends in the audience. I know not all of you are conservative, so I'm sorry I've not been able to see that side. But I do very much hope you recognize that so many of the arguments that have come out of the non-progressive movement in the 1920s are not just reactionary. They're not there to defend some privilege of some people. In fact, if anything, much of what I read when I read the conservatives, especially of the 1950s, now we're in an era of populism, and it's so hard to distinguish what is conservative versus what is populist. And we also have this, we're in a moment now, and we've been in a moment for 20, 25 years, where consumerism has been a commodity, conservatism has been a commodity. It's been this thing that's sold on radios and Fox News and so forth. And I think this is horrible. I think it's terribly damaging to the seriousness of the movement. But the point I want to make here, if we can forget all of that for a moment, if we can forget the very loud plastic people on Fox or on the radio, if we can forget for a moment those people who claim the name of conservatism as they're beating the snot out of our enemies, whoever they are, abroad, droning people to death. I mean, if we can forget that for a moment and we can recognize the roots of conservatism, if we can think about a Burke or a de Tocqueville or a Kirk or a Nisbet, we are talking about very, very deep men, some of the greatest thinkers of their life, of their lifetimes. And certainly, it's not just men. We think about a Flannery O'Connor, we think about a Willa Cather, all of these people who were so deeply involved in their own day and age of what would have been called conservatism. These are very humane people. They are not racist, they are not classicist, they are not trying to put other people in a box. If anything, they want to liberate us. They want us to be genuinely dignified, humane, and free people. it's kind of hard to argue against, to my mind. So thank you very much. Scott, we have about 5 minutes, is that right? Oh, okay, I thought we were done at 2:15, so that's great. Anybody have any questions or thoughts about anything? And if there's something I can address in particular about some of Nisbet's ideas, there were a few things I didn't get into that might be interesting, probably pretty controversial. Dan, hey, I didn't know you were in here. Good to see you. That's another friend I should have mentioned earlier.
Well, yeah, I thought I would ask, in the spirit of sort of conservative, progressive communication, about, first of all, the New Left's reception of Robert Nisbet, and second of all, the extent to which Nisbet was familiar during the Vietnam era with characters such as William Appleman Williams. I believe that Nisbet reviewed a Williams book in commentary during that period, and there was a bit of a back and forth in the commentary letters section where Nisbet wound up saying, basically, I do kind of have a certain common feeling with some of the left-wing critics of American foreign policy at that time.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan. As many of you may know, Dan is the former editor and just an amazing person and writer of the American Conservative, really representing this tradition that I think, at least I've been trying to talk about here. I can't answer that you and I had talked about that before, and I have not done enough research on the Vietnam controversy and the way that he was thinking about that, especially in debates with professors at the University of Wisconsin. So I can't answer that, Dan, and I apologize. It's something that I still very much need to look into, and I have it certainly one of the things I will be doing probably in the next year or so, and looking forward to that. In terms of the progressive dialogue, one of the problems, of course, is that progressivism, and I'm sorry I didn't get into this because this I think would be something worth talking about. If we really want to look at the essence of progressivism and conservatism, I don't think we can do it in a left-right way. We know that there are all kinds of right-wing progressives, just as there are left-wing progressives. Conservatism, people like Russell Kirk never, not once, use the term right-wing, even though he is the founder of post-war conservatism. People like Christopher Dawson, not someone we've talked about, but Christopher Dawson, great figure, was adamantly opposed to the idea of a left-right spectrum. He believed that it was a means of just using propaganda to basically distract us, that it's not real. We have to talk instead about person, anti-person. We have to talk about dignity versus some kind of use of a person, not allowing that person to thrive, but using them for our own means. And when we look at progressivism, and I think most modern progressives, I'm not sure the original progressives in America were as kind, but I think most modern progressives are extremely well-intentioned. In fact, I think probably most modern progressives are better intentioned than most modern conservatives who go by that name. But I also think that there's a danger in that because progressivism is not left and right, but we often associate it as such, we tend to think of it as having a certain political character. Progressivism is truly a theory of history. It can't be anything but that. It's an idea that the world is moving towards something. And if we believe that the world is moving towards something, whatever that thing is, that means that history in and of itself is a force. It has a kind of movement. In the classic Hegelian definition of progressivism, you always have a thing combating another thing, neither can survive, and a third thing follows. And here we can, I quoted Pink Floyd earlier, I can quote The Who. This is where the old boss is no different, right? The new boss is no different than the old boss. And I think there's something to that. There's a critique of progressivism that's not against progressive ideals, it's against the very historical foundation of what progressivism is. So my attempt to answer the first part of your question, Dan, is that when we came out of World War II, progressivism was a very positive word. It meant, even though Hitler used the word as well, as did Mussolini, and they saw themselves very much as progressives, and of course they admired Lenin and they admired Stalin, even though they're rival gangs. They saw themselves as progressive. But in America, we tended to associate progressivism with FDR's attempt to help the poor through the New Deal and through the Great Depression and so forth. And there really wasn't anything in the way of conservatism that was taken seriously. And that's what makes someone like Kirk or even Albert J. Nock, someone we don't you know extremely well, better than anybody, but people like them who, through their Buckley, through their real force of personality, basically said, there's somebody else out here. Right? And we're not right-wing. I mean, you get that with some of the people in the 1950s. We're conservative. And that means we're trying to conserve the best of what has come before. And Buckley, in his usual kind of mischievous Buckley way, what does he say? Well, what do I believe? I believe that I want to stand in front of history and yell, stop, which is the ultimate anti-progressive statement. I just want to get out there and say, don't move so quickly. And that, it's not left-right. It's a very different vision of history. And I think people like Russell Kirk, people like Leo Strauss, they are trying to give us a different vision of what history is. It's not this inalterable movement of conflict, 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 conflict towards this end. It is instead, because of free will, a huge mess. Life is messy. And this is where we see someone like C.S. Lewis in his own fiction saying, what do we study? Well, we study the human person. How do we know the human person? You don't know the human person. That's why you study the human person, because you can't fit the human person into a box or into this trajectory. We're good, we're bad. Sometimes we live in good times, sometimes we live in bad times. Rarely is it that clear cut. It's almost always a mess. There are good people doing bad things and bad people doing okay things. Sometimes we restrain them, sometimes we don't. Every one of us in this room at this very moment is making all kinds of decisions. Every one of us, right? Is Birzer almost done? What's happening next? Is Gleaves, did he provide some good food in between this break? Why did my pencil just fall? Do I want to pick it up? I mean, these are things we're all dealing with at the moment. Now imagine multiplying that every moment by 7 billion people. That is complicated. That is so complicated. And that's exactly what I think the conservative vision says. And it is dour in a lot of ways. But it basically says, look, there are things you will never know. There are mysteries in life. Let's understand that and go from there. So, Dan, I can't answer that second question, which was so good, but I hope at least thinking about this difference of progressivism and conservatism, if we can move beyond political labels, I think, and I'm not saying you guys haven't, because I haven't been here, but I think in society at large, that would be very, very helpful.
Brad, you set out, in fact, Dan, I think you had my question and you solved it, because I was curious about the Hegelian in Nisbet's thought and how precisely he was confronting it, but I think you've just unpacked it well enough. So I had to improvise and think of another question since I dropped my pencil. And
Good.
Yeah. No, let me ask you a question, Brad, about the craft of biography and how it is leading you to some of the discoveries and the conclusions that you are encountering. You take joy as a historian in going into the archives and reading, and I'm curious, who is it that Nisbet has the most productive letter exchange with, for example, and are you discovering in that process that the public Nisbet that we know through community and the lectures and the distinguished public life is in conflict with things that you're discovering about what he's saying to his best friends?
Yeah.
And how are you dealing with that as a biographer?
Yeah, thanks, Gleaves. That's an incredible question. I personally, for what it's worth, I think that when writing biography, we owe it to our subject to treat them as fairly, just as absolutely as fairly as possible, meaning we have to look at their quirks as well as their excellences. We have to try and measure if someone does a stupid thing on one day, but we never see it again in the rest of their life. Well, how much, okay, we have evidence that this person did that stupid thing on that one day. Well, how do we measure that? I think there has to be real proportion and balance in trying to understand that. And I don't mean to sound cheesy. You can use whatever word you want. But I think the successful biographer, and I see someone, I think David McCullough does this beautifully. I don't think David McCullough is good when it comes to explaining ideas. He's amazing when he comes to explaining personality and character. That's his strength. So you could read his biography of John Adams. You won't get any of John Adams' ideas. And Adams wrote more books than any of the other founders. You wouldn't know that from reading McCullough's biography. But you do know exactly what kind of person John Adams was. And that's really, that's an incredible gift that he's able to do that. And we have other people who've done it as well. As someone that may not be that familiar to you, one of my favorite biographies, strangely enough, though I love this person, he's one of my favorite characters, Sitting Bull. If you've ever read Robert Utley's biography of Sitting Bull, it's just, you can't put it down. First of all, Sitting Bull's just fascinating, but Utley just captures him, and how he gets him, you just know you are there with Sitting Bull at every moment. And that, to me, that's what makes a biography so beautiful, when you really feel like that person could be sitting next to you. Not just the author, but the subject as well. Nisbet's interesting because he was a very private, incredibly private person. So whereas someone like Dr. Kirk, who also was very private, but expressed himself all the time on the written page, he has letters to everybody and from everyone, and he saved everything. Nisbet would not save things, and in fact directed a lot of his papers to be destroyed at the end before he died. So we actually don't have, we have some, and they're spread out everywhere, but there are not a ton of Nisbet papers, which is unfortunate. His published writings, of course, but not his correspondence. And yet he did write a lot. So here's, if this kind of answers you, and it's probably not deep enough, Gleaves, to do justice to your question, but one of the funniest things about Nisbet, he spends his whole career writing about the necessity of community. That's his career. He writes about that all the time. This is community. This is a guy who, when he ends up in DC at the end of his life, he so hates visiting his neighbors and his good friends that even 3 blocks away, he will write them letters because he just doesn't, so, that doesn't quite, here's a guy who loves community, but clearly doesn't want to be a part of one. And that, I find that very interesting. It's human, right? In some ways, it's kind of lovable and quirky, but it is a little odd. So we have people, and some of the people who loved him and just wanted to be with him all the time, he had no time. He'd write you a long, long letter, but don't come to his house and knock on his door. So I don't know if that answers you, Gleaves, but when it comes to students, he gave all of his time, always, but of course that was more of a public role, right? There wasn't that personal element. It was a distance between professor and student, and he was very accessible then. So, yeah, good. Paul, I didn't know you were here either. Good to see you.
It's good to see you, Brad.
As always, this is one of my grad school colleagues.
Yes, I'm the keeper of the secrets. So I learned so much about Nisbet. I thank you for that paper that you just delivered, and look forward to reading what you write in the future. And so my mind is still trying to wrap around the idea of the anarchist promoter of community.
Yeah.
And I think it means he's a communitarian anti-statist. But I was especially intrigued by your discussion of community coming off Burke and Nisbet, and you talked about how you need to know who you are, and there are all the associations that you use yourself as an example that you need, and then that you might voluntarily strip away from yourself as you develop. But I guess what I'd like to just hear more about, maybe it's not a question, is a reflection on what is the utility of community exactly? Because you place it as at the center of a kind of social theoretical tradition that comes out of Burke and Tocqueville, and that Nisbet's all important in recovering,
right.
Maybe oddly the way some others on the left are. But what exactly is the utility of community? I still don't quite understand it. When you might also look at conformity as being in some way due to community, right?
Sure,
the
absolutely.
Sort of, fear of
Mores,
conformity,
norms.
That goes back a long way, right?
Yeah.
That all these things you're stripping away are the things you're stripping away in order to become fully actualized individual, something like that, right?
Right.
And then some people come up in very gravely impaired communities that are actually very damaging to them in their selfhood and personhood. And then you can blame much of the problems that they have because of the dysfunctionality of their community and the roles and problematic things that the community assigns to them. So I have that in the background, but then I thought, well, there's all kinds of problems with the community, but I still don't understand what is the utility of community as Nisbet understood it with these thinkers.
Yeah, no, thank you, Paul. It's a great question. Nisbet, of course, and he would never talk about the utility of something, right? Utility is a bad word for Nisbet, right? Where your efficiency, utility, progress, those are words that he thinks are demeaning to human dignity. So, I mean, he's not an ideologue about this, but he generally avoids those kinds of things. And he's very much a great books, great ideas kind of guy. And a lot of what he would think comes out of the Aristotelian tradition of politics. Man is not meant to live alone. Right? Alone, he becomes either a beast or a god. He is meant to live in community. And it's in that community that we find both our strengths and our weaknesses. It's in that community that our gifts flourish, but our sins are diminished through those very mores and norms. So there's a difference for them, especially Kirk and Nisbet. There's a difference between following mores and norms. Now, you shouldn't do them blindly. Right, you've always got to be prudential about these things, and you have to make decisions. But we recognize them. But for someone like Kirk or Nisbet, the norms are things that are found over time. So the English tradition of common law is a perfect example of this, where nobody sits down to write the common law. It's one of those things through historical accident. It appears and comes into being. And of course, this is one of the most frustrating things for lawyers, because if you cite the common law, if you want to know the origin of it, of course, the ultimate origin of common law is it's beyond human memory. Well, that's really frustrating if you're in a law court, right? It's like where you get, what's beyond human memory? You know, and if you say it's not beyond human memory, then it's very difficult to put it in the common law. So it's that old, very Anglo-Saxon tradition, Aristotelian, but following through the Anglo-Saxons. But I would also, Paul, I would note too, something that both Kirk and Nisbet really liked, and it was a line, it's a beautiful line. You can see why the Romantics loved Burke so much. But in his second book against the French, Further Reflections on the Revolution in France, he has this statement. It was one I was going to read, but we were just getting too short on time. He has this statement that I know Tomas he's heard me say it so many times in classes. I'm sure he could say it with me. But the statement is, dark and inscrutable are the ways in which we come into the world. And that, for Burke, as well as for Nisbet, free will is incredibly important. We make decisions all the time, and they were both fighting against predestinarian thought in religion as well as determinism in science. Nisbet especially, they were very worried about those kinds of things, that we were allowing science to kind of say, well, of course we do this or that. Well, maybe we have an inclination to do this or that, but our free will, according to Nisbet, still allows us not to. But the one thing we have absolutely no choice about is when we come into the world, dark and inscrutable. So that, in that sense, we are predestined, but in no other sense, according to this thinking. So community is that way in which I discover not only what is good in me, but also what is ridiculous in me. And the ridiculous aspect has to be stopped, and the beautiful aspect has to be thrown out there. That's also one of course, de Tocqueville's great critiques of democracy. We have free will, therefore, if we're all equal, we can choose to say, Scott, I want you to be the best Scott you could possibly be. I could also say, well, why did Scott get that? I can't jump like that. That's not fair. So I could be jealous too, and those are the choices we make. So equality in and of itself is not bad, it's a great thing. But what we do with it, with our free will, that's the danger. If I make it a jealous thing rather than saying, I want you to be amazing. And of course it can't be my amazingness, because an excellence by definition must be unique. It's not. We cannot have the same excellences. Even if we do the same thing really well, one of us has to be better at it. So that's the kind of thing that a true equality, according to de Tocqueville and Nisbet, that's what we should search for. So, Mrs. Kirk.
Brad, we first met Nisbet in 1967 out in California. No, I think it was before that. I think it was 64.
At Riverside?
At Riverside.
Yeah.
And he was very charming. The last time we met Nisbet and met with him was in Washington, D.C. when he was at AEI. And at that time, he had just published a book called Conservative Ideology,
Right.
a small book.
Right.
And when we started dinner, he said, now, Russell, don't get upset. Because
Right.
he said, but I published this book, but you know, the word ideology today can mean many things. Russell always defined ideology as political fanaticism and
Right.
said that conservatism was not an ideology, that it was a disposition, allowing him to change some things
Right.
accordingly as time went on. But they had a great discussion. It was very civil, and Russell never criticized that or anything like that. Why did he do that?
Well, I'm definitely with your late husband on that. I think Dr. Kirk wrote the best things ever written on the meaning of ideology and what it means, and I don't think Robert Nisbet was right. But there is a reason, there are really two reasons that they had a difference of opinion on that. Dr. Kirk is thinking in very large, eternal terms. And Nisbet, being an atheist, is not. He is thinking about the world, self-contained, here it is, from one point to another. So when Dr. Kirk talks about that notion of ideology, he truly sees it as an aberration of thought, because it's so new. It's only been since the French Revolution. There's nothing new under the sun. And I mean, you know, your husband was not a religious fanatic, but he obviously had strong ideas about the hereafter. And that was very important to him. Whereas for Nisbet, conservatism was all founded by de Tocqueville in the 1830s. Now they're Burkean, but Burke was too much of a romantic to be a conservative. So it's de Tocqueville who founds conservatism as a reaction to the French Revolution. So in that, all conservatism for Nisbet is anti-French revolutionary thought placed on communism and fascism in the 20th century. That's why it's an ideology for him, because there's a very set lineage. It's from de Tocqueville to the present, and it's always about combating fascism and communism. That was why. So I don't know if that answers you, Annette, but I really think it comes down to a fundamental difference on the way they viewed the world versus the next world. So, Jeff.
Scott said to say this would be the last
Oh, okay.
question.
Thank you.
Kind of intimidating looking at you like this, by the way.
I like that. It's the hair right now.
Yeah.
I desperately need to get it cut. My mother would call me
Wanted to
communist,
respond
so.
to Paul's question to you. Maybe this will be useful to you. One of the things Tocqueville talks about in Democracy in America is that one of the effects of equality in America is that it leaves people feeling isolated, right? Alienated, isolated, alone, and so forth. And so what it will create is a kind of mania for unity. And so there are different ways Tocqueville talks about this in Democracy in America, in which that mania for unity will manifest itself in destructive ways. And I think if you read a book like Quest for a Community, that seems to be the greater concern, right? I mean, because one of the things he says is human beings will always seek community. And if they don't find good ones, they will create bad ones for themselves. And he's more interested in the way we create bad ones than the way that we create good ones, which I think, like Tocqueville, he seems to be largely kind of natural, organic kind of communities that don't get created, right? We're born into them, and we kind of live in and out of them. So that's more of a comment than a
Oh, no, that's great, Jeff. And that's a perfect answer to Paul. And I don't want to suggest that community is the salvation of everything. This is not a fix-all problem. It is, for Nisbet, a fundamental social aspect. And therefore, we have to get it right in order to have a stable society. Not a perfect society, but a stable society. And we're still going to have instability from time to time. But yeah, that's just part of the experimentation of community. So thank you, both of you guys. That's a very good caveat for this. Very good. So thank you, everyone, very much. I hope you have a great rest of the conference. Please, thank you.